Okay, in this short presentation, we're going to talk about some of the most pressing issues when discussing God's existence with others and how we can ask the right questions and how we can just really clarify what we're talking about with such an important topic. So we have a little chart here on God's existence, and I think this can help in how we discuss this with others. So if you look on the left side here, you'll see we talk about showing God exists and knowing God exists. And there is a little bit of a difference here. There's some clarification needs to happen. So we're talking about showing and knowing. Obviously, a lot of people will say they know God exists. And if you look at the bottom part here that says knowing God exists, they'll talk about how they know God exists immediately. Sometimes they'll just say, well, I can look at creation or the moral law that's in me or my conscience tells me that there's a God. People have an intuitive ability to directly apprehend the existence of God. Of course, that's discussed in Romans 1 and Romans 2 of the Bible. Now, you may say, well, you're appealing to the Bible, but if the Bible speaks to reality and people do have this direct apprehension of God's existence, then that's the way it goes. And so for some people, obviously they think God exists through those two mediums, through the gift of the created order and through the moral law. This is also discussed in Alvin Plantinga's work called Properly Basic Belief, where he talks about some people just know God exists immediately. It's immediate awareness of God's existence. Of course, other people say they know God exists through the work of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit gives them a knowledge of God that is immediate, and it's something that is not, has to be broken down. It's just something they know intuitively or something they know immediately through the work of the Holy Spirit. But when it comes to using those arguments with people outside or people that don't think there's a God, those things can be a challenge because not everybody has that immediate awareness or that intuitive knowledge. At least if they do, as Paul talks about in Romans 1, they suppress that knowledge and they turn away from it and they don't recognize it at all. And we know that that happens all the time. So in many cases, we have to differentiate between knowing and showing God exists. So when it comes up to showing God exists on the top here, on the top left, that's where we use evidence and argumentation. And that's where we can talk about natural theology or revealed theology. That's history or nature. And sometimes we use natural theology arguments like Edward Fazer's work that he's doing right now with his book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. And we talk about arguments in the world of nature. Those are things that that we can talk about. But then we talk about history. History has to do more with God revealing himself in a text, such as the Bible. And then we talk about different kinds of texts. Some people argue the Quran is their text. Some people argue the Book of Mormon is their text. That's where we have to give reason and argumentation as to why the Bible is a true revelation from God. And then, of course, we also can argue that God is the best explanation for specific features of reality. That means that we look at certain things around us and we think that God explains those features of reality better than nature alone does. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. And so, also, I just want to mention on the bottom left here, what talks about giving reasons why Jesus rose from the dead. Most likely, if you say you experience the Holy Spirit, there's no doubt that many people have not had that experience, and there's no way you can argue for that experience if Jesus did not physically rise from the dead. You can't divorce the two because he talked about how he would send the Holy Spirit to indwell people, and that's not a possibility if Jesus didn't physically rise from the dead. And that means you're going to need good historical arguments for why Jesus rose from the dead. If you just argue that the Holy Spirit confirms to you that it's true, then basically you're back to the same thing that a Mormon could say. They say they read the Book of Mormon and the Holy Spirit confirms the Book of Mormon as being true. So you're going to need good reasons why Jesus rose from the dead as well. Now, if you look to the far right here on the far right column, Obviously, God's existence impacts the way we view reality, and then we're dealing with worldview issues. A worldview is how you view reality. It answers questions such as why we are here, where we are going, why do humans matter. But we need to remember that God's existence is not dependent on whether we feel it is true. God exists or he doesn't exist. God is an objective truth. It's not based on your preference or emotions. We're saying that God is an objective reality. Your faith does not make God exist. God either exists or he doesn't exist. Your faith only appropriates what's already in the Bible. It doesn't make the Bible true. It's not like magic. Now, some people obviously choose to stay busy and they stay apathetic about whether God exists and they think the God question will go away, but we need to remember whether you're happy or not does not make God exist. Whether you're happy or not does not determine whether God exists. God exists or he doesn't exist. And so sometimes it's good to challenge people with the question whether it's true or not, and they need to remember that God's existence does not go away just because they don't think there's a God. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. Now, obviously, we can talk about evidence and argumentation, but I'm just saying that some people come along and they think if they stay really busy and if they're really happy and they have a lot of stuff, that God's existence will go away. And we need to remember that whether you feel or not the law of gravity is there, it's still there on a daily basis. So we need to remember we need to challenge people on that issue. Now, something that comes up also, we're talking about God's existence, are the things that come up in this slide right here. Now, when we talk about showing God exists, obviously science comes up a lot because many people think science is the only way of knowing things. It's the only paradigm. It's the best paradigm to help us gather knowledge, and people are definitely big believers that science is the best way to gather information. And so that comes up. Sometimes you're talking about God's existence. So sometimes we bring up design arguments. This is on the far left, and we talk about whether nature is purposeless or not, because if you don't think there's a God, nature certainly is purposeless because nature has no end goal or direction. It has no teleology. Now, when it comes to science, we need to remember that science only studies impersonal explanations to reality. It's not looking at personal or agent explanations to reality. So let's say you talk about things such as the fine-tuning argument or biological information theory arguments, or you may talk about how the earth is set up for us to be here. Obviously, a lot of people believe that unguided impersonal forces can account for these things. They just believe chance and nature alone can account for these things. So that's why we need to remember that science generally only answers the how questions. Science talks about how the mechanisms work, how nature works. It doesn't necessarily deal with the why questions, deeper purpose issues, such as does the universe or humans or Earth itself have a deeper purpose or end goal? Science just simply doesn't deal with teleological issues. It doesn't deal with final causation. It studies material causation. And then science certainly doesn't allow for the who questions, whether there's an agent or a mind behind the universe, or whether there's a mind behind features of the biological realm. It doesn't deal with agent and personal explanations. So we need to remember that science has its limits, and we need to be open to different kinds of explanations in reality. Also, when people talk about science, and we need to remember there are sciences, different kinds of science. There's different branches of science, such as cosmology, anthropology, biology, physics, and chemistry. So we need to remember that we don't want to just say science has shown there is a God or no God. We need to talk about sciences. And remember, finally, on the bottom here, bottom left corner here, remember science is the study of natural causation. It's methodological naturalism. Science is built on methodological naturalism. It's not even set up to allow for intelligent causation. And so we just need to remember these things come up in our discussions about God's existence. Now on the far right here, when we talk about showing God exists, a lot of people think that God should show them a sign, or they should be able to see God directly and they should know he's there. I mean, they'll say, well, I can't see God directly, and they just misunderstand the nature of God, because the nature of the object determines how you know it. And the only way you're going to know what God is like, his nature, what his nature is like, is by looking into natural theology, revealed theology. Unless God shows us what he's like, his nature, we're not going to know what kind of being he is. And so we can't see God directly, but we can make inferences from observing cause and effect relationships in the world around us. That's called abduction. And we can talk about whether nature alone can account for certain features of reality, such as moral values, moral duties, whether nature alone can account for things such as the laws of logic or nature itself, or why the laws of nature allow for consciousness and life to emerge. Now, obviously, that's what we do with the abductive method. We look at features of reality and we talk about whether nature by itself can account for several features of reality. I've only given an overview here. We'd have to break these down into greater detail, but there are lots of materials out there that do this. I'm just going over some of the basics. Then we get into the issue of proof and evidence. And of course, for many people, they say that they need proof for evidence, and you can't prove God's existence. There's no evidence for God's existence, or there's a lack of evidence. And on the far left corner, I think it's important that we ask clarifying questions. We need to define what we mean by proof or evidence. We need to ask, does proof or evidence mean you have to have 100% certainty, no possible counter-arguments? And for many people, they assume they need to have certitude. Certitude is something we mean when we have no doubt at all, when it's beyond doubt, when it's indubitable. And we need to clarify, is that what you mean by having proof or evidence for God's existence? You need to have certitude, because that's not attainable. And of course, for some people, they need to have an exhaustive knowledge. That means that they want every question answered exhaustively, and then they think they'll commit to God, or they'll yield their lives over to God. Now, we need to remember on the far right here that there are what's called inductive proofs, and in inductive reasoning, that reasons from effect to cause, such as the resurrection of Jesus. For example, we see the effect in history. We see the birth of the Jesus movement, and then we ask, what is the cause of that? What caused that movement to get starting? Of course, for Christians, we believe the resurrection of Jesus was a starting point for the birth of the Jesus movement. We could debate that with others. We also need to remember that inductive arguments only offer probable support, a high degree of probability. Of course, with history, it's in the past. We weren't there to see it. And in many cases in science, we weren't there to observe things in science. We weren't there to observe the beginning of the universe. We weren't there to observe how life came from non-life. We weren't there to observe many things in the past that science deals with. And so we don't get absolute certainty with inductive arguments. We only get high probability. Now, there's also deductive proofs. Those are things that are prior to experience, and that reasons from cause to effect. That deals with rational argumentation for God's existence, such as Edward Fazer's book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. That's more on the lines of natural theology. And then when it comes to abductive proofs, or evidence or inference to the best explanation, that's something we deal with in science, history, and archaeology and criminology. That deals with things that we weren't there to directly observe as well, similar to induction, but people can observe things. They can observe features of reality, and then they can infer to what is the best explanation for that feature of reality. So you have a detective that shows up at a crime scene. He sees the murder victim. He wasn't there to observe it, but he gathers the information. He talks to the witnesses. He gathers what's called circumstantial evidence, and then he presents his case in a court of law. So the box cut off here a little bit on the far right. We don't have direct evidence sometimes where we saw something directly, but we have circumstantial evidence, and that's very important. And then, of course, I have this feature here on the far left column. You kind of cut off here on the bottom. Remember, when we talk about evidence or proof, Ask yourself what level of certainty you had or you do have when you married your current wife or spouse or you took a job. You may say, well, I know this is the right job. I know this is the right spouse, but you may have levels of uncertainty there. There may be some unknowns, of course. So, we make decisions based on things that we don't know for certain. And you can still say, I know this is the right thing to do, but you may have certain levels of uncertainty there, questions that go unanswered. And so these are some of the things that come up in our discussions with people, and I just want to help you with this. I hope this provides some background when you're talking with people. Always ask questions, always ask clarifying questions, but remember that a lot of people don't know what they mean by proof and evidence when they're talking about those things. So make sure that you know these different kinds of proof and evidence, the kind of proof and evidence that's out there. Are they talking about inductive evidence or inductive proof or abductive proof or deductive proof or direct evidence or circumstantial evidence? So I hope this helps you in your discussions with others. Have a good day.